The war that created this hunter began long before his first shot was fired. On June 22, 1941, the German Wehrmacht unleashed Operation Barbarossa, the largest invasion in human history. More than 3 million Axis soldiers crossed into the Soviet Union in a single coordinated strike. Thousands of tanks rolled east. Aircraft darkened the sky. Entire Soviet armies collapsed in days. German commanders believed the campaign would be over before winter. They had defeated France in 6 weeks. They expected Russia to fall even faster. First, everything seemed to confirm their confidence. Soviet defenses shattered under the speed and violence of the assault. Millions of Red Army soldiers were killed or captured. Cities burned. Rail lines collapsed. By the end of 1941, German forces stood at the gates of Moscow itself. On paper, the war was already decided. The battlefield was changing in ways German planners had not fully understood. As the advance pushed deeper into Soviet territory, the environment began to assert itself. The roads turned to mud, vehicles broke down, fuel froze, weapons malfunctioned, and then winter arrived, not the mild winter imagined by German meteorologists, but the kind of cold that kills men who stand still for too long. Temperatures plunged far below zero. Snow swallowed roads and landmarks alike. German soldiers, still equipped with summer uniforms and thin boots, began to suffer frostbite by the thousands. Entire units were immobilized by cold alone. The blitzkrieg that had shattered Europe slowed into a grinding war of survival. Early 1942, the Eastern Front had transformed into something entirely different. This was no longer a war of speed and maneuver. It became a war of attrition measured in meters gained and bodies lost. Trenches cut into frozen earth. Forests became killing grounds. Visibility shrank to a few hundred meters, sometimes less. In this new war, technology mattered less than endurance. Patience mattered more than firepower. Into this world that Fyodor Oklopkov was sent. He was not a product of military academies. He did not come from Moscow or Leningrad. He came from Yakutia, one of the most isolated and unforgiving regions on Earth. Winters there regularly reached -40 or 50 degrees Celsius. Survival was not guaranteed by strength or courage, but by understanding the land. In childhood, Oklopkov had learned how to read snow the way others read maps. He learned how long a body could remain still before cold betrayed it. He learned how sound traveled across frozen ground and how wind erased footprints. He learned patience not as a discipline, but as a necessity. In Siberia, rushing meant death. War came. The Soviet Union did not initially know what to do with men like him. Early in the conflict, Oklopkov served as a machine gunner, one soldier among millions thrown into defensive battles against an overwhelming enemy. He was wounded repeatedly. He watched his unit suffer catastrophic losses. He watched his brother die. Like countless others, he could have broken under the weight of it. Instead, something different happened. Soviet commanders began to realize that survival on the Eastern Front required more than numbers. It required soldiers who could endure isolation, cold, and silence for hours or days at a time. It required men who could operate alone, far from support, and return alive. Oklopkov was not chosen because he asked to be a sniper. He was chosen because others noticed what he did not say, what he did not fear, and how little the environment seemed to affect him. Where others shivered, he waited. Where others rushed shots, he held fire. Where others tried to dominate the battlefield, he disappeared into it. In late 1942, the Karelian Front had become one of the most brutal sectors of the war. Dense forests, endless snow, and limited visibility created ideal conditions for snipers. German units relied heavily on trained marksmen to suppress Soviet movement. Sniper duels became routine, but they followed doctrine, positioning, spotting, repeated engagements. Oklopkov did not follow doctrine. Line of trenches and objectives, he saw it as hunting ground. German soldiers were not targets in formation, they were moving patterns. Officers paused at predictable points. Snipers betrayed themselves with tiny mistakes. A glint of glass, a shift of weight, impatience after hours of waiting. Like most snipers, Oklopkov did not seek repeated shots. In his world, one shot was all that mattered. After that, survival depended on disappearance. The blanket was not a trick learned from a manual. It was an extension of how he had always lived. Snow was not cover to hide behind, it was something to become. Wrapped in white cloth, motionless against the frozen ground, he did not look concealed. He looked absent. Patrols passed within meters of positions he had already abandoned. Counter-snipers searched where doctrine told them to search, long after Oklopkov had moved on. Artillery flattened empty ground. Reports described an enemy that could not be fixed, could not be located, and could not be intimidated. Time German commanders realized they were facing something different. Fear had already taken root. Men hesitated to leave trenches. Officers avoided observation posts. Snipers sent to hunt the phantom never returned. It was not because the Soviet Union had found a better rifle. It was because the war had entered a phase where the environment itself had chosen its champion. And Fyodor Oklopkov was exactly the kind of man that environment had been shaping his entire life. By the time Fyodor Oklopkov was formally converted into a sniper, the war on the Karelian front had already stripped away every illusion about heroism. It was not a front defined by sweeping offensives or dramatic breakthroughs. It was a frozen stalemate where entire weeks passed without visible movement, and then dozens of men died in a few silent minutes. The forest absorbed sound. Snow erased evidence. Survival depended less on courage than on restraint. Snipers dominated this kind of terrain, or so German doctrine claimed. They operated in pairs, relied on spotting scopes, range cards, and carefully prepared firing positions. They were trained to engage repeatedly from well-chosen locations, maintaining pressure and asserting control over no man's land. On paper, they were superior in every measurable way. Oklopkov ignored all of it. He did not prepare firing lanes or calculate fields of fire. He did not measure success in time spent holding ground. His thinking came from somewhere older than doctrine. Siberia, a hunter who fires twice from the same position dies. Animals do not charge blindly. They circle, they listen, they wait for mistakes. The first shot is the moment of maximum advantage. After that, the advantage belongs to the hunted. Oklopkov carried that rule into war without modification. He chose positions that made no tactical sense to trained soldiers. Shallow depressions in snowfields, tree lines that offered no obvious cover, open ground, where German patrols assumed no one could survive motionless for long. Wrapped in white cloth, pressed flat against frozen earth, he did not look hidden. He looked like part of the terrain. Hours passed, sometimes days. The routine. An officer paused to observe. A machine gun team repositioned. A sniper adjusted his scope just long enough for sunlight to flash across the lens. Oklopkov did not rush. He waited until movement became habit, until confidence replaced caution. He fired once. Confirm the kill. He did not need to. In the cold, a hit was final. The moment the rifle cracked, he was already moving slowly, deliberately, leaving no clear trail. German counterfire tore into empty snow. Artillery flattened places he had abandoned hours earlier. The blanket was not camouflage in the conventional sense. It was deception through absence. German soldiers searched for shapes, shadows, outlines. Oklopkov removed all of them. From a distance, he looked like nothing worth noticing. Up close, he was already gone. Kills accumulated, German command responded predictably. They assumed they were facing multiple Soviet snipers operating in coordination. Reports described fire from different angles, at different times, with no fixed pattern. Entire sectors seemed lethal one day and silent the next. Wrong. One man. Counter-sniper teams were deployed, some of the best marksmen on the Eastern Front. These men were experienced, patient, and confident. They knew the rules of sniper warfare. They expected duels fought on known terms. Klopkov never gave them that duel. He observed them the way he observed wolves. He learned how long they waited before shifting position, how often they checked their rear, how frustration crept into their movements. When a counter-sniper revealed himself, even slightly, the hunt was already over. Shot. German snipers began to die without ever firing a round. Followed. Advance without artillery preparation. Observation posts were abandoned. Soldiers stopped lighting cigarettes in exposed areas. Men learned that standing still could be as dangerous as moving. Morale reports described units convinced they were being watched constantly, even during quiet periods. Rain amplified that fear. Snow carried sound strangely. A single rifle crack echoed across frozen forests, then vanished. There was no direction to fix on, no position to suppress, only the certainty that someone had been there. When commanders escalated again, artillery barrages saturated entire grid squares. Mortars hammered suspected firing zones. Nothing worked. Klopkov adapted without changing his method. He simply waited longer and moved farther. The battlefield bent around him. This was not his accuracy, though it was exceptional. It was his refusal to think like a soldier. He did not seek dominance. He sought inevitability. Every engagement followed the same quiet logic. Someone would make a mistake. Someone would pause too long. Someone would believe they were safe. The forest would claim them. Numbers grew, not in dramatic bursts, but steadily, relentlessly. 13 or 14 kills a month, sustained across years of combat. No breakdowns, no periods of recklessness, just patience applied without mercy. Time German intelligence realized the scale of what they were facing, it was already too late. Entire units had altered their behavior because of one invisible hunter. Resources meant for offensives were diverted to hunting a man who refused to be found. Blanket did not make Klopkov deadly. Had become. Conflict where technology mattered less than adaptation, and where the man who understood the environment better than anyone else would decide who lived long enough to leave footprints in the snow. By the time German command fully understood what was happening, the damage was already embedded into the structure of the front. It was no longer a sniper problem. It was a psychological collapse. German units operating in Klopkov's sector began behaving differently from those elsewhere on the Eastern Front. Patrols moved slower, officers avoided exposed positions, snipers hesitated to deploy at all, men stopped trusting the terrain that doctrine told them was safe. The front did not advance or retreat, it froze. Reports filtered upward, describing an enemy presence that could not be fixed. Soldiers were dying without engagement. Counter-sniper teams failed to return. Artillery strikes produced no results. The same phrases appeared again and again in after-action reports. No visual contact, no muzzle flash, no identifiable position. Germans had encountered many skilled Soviet snipers before. This felt different. They were not fighting a man who wanted to win a duel. They were being hunted by someone who did not care if he was known, credited, or even seen. His presence was defined entirely by absence. Commanders escalated the response. Entire platoons were assigned to hunt him. Dedicated hunter-killer teams were formed, combining snipers, spotters, and infantry support. They saturated likely firing zones with overlapping observation. They laid traps. They used decoys. They waited for him to make the kind of mistake that doctrine insisted all snipers eventually make. Or did. Understood something they did not. Pressure reveals patterns. The more aggressively the Germans searched, the more predictable their movements became. The same types of soldiers were assigned to the same roles. The same observation points were reused. The same impatience crept in after long hours of waiting. A man shifted his weight. Another adjusted his scope too often. A third chose comfort over concealment. Moments were enough. To exploit them, he let them repeat. He let confidence settle. Only when behavior became routine did he act. His shots were not reactions. They were conclusions. Confirmed kill deepened the psychological effect. German soldiers began to believe the front itself was hostile. Snowfields were no longer neutral ground. Forests felt alive. Silence became threatening. Even time worked against them. The longer nothing happened, the more convinced they became that something would. Fear spread faster than casualties. Men stopped volunteering for sniper duty. Patrol leaders requested artillery support for movements that once required none. Units hesitated to rotate into sectors known to be active, even when no contact had been reported for days. The absence of action did not reassure them. It frightened them more. War, morale determines what orders can be carried out. Oklopkov did not need to kill constantly. He only needed to kill just enough to remind the enemy that he was still there. The front remained operational, but efficiency degraded. Observation declined. Initiative disappeared. German units fought defensively, not because they were ordered to, but because fear made anything else feel reckless. Strategic perspective. This mattered. Sniper operations were resources not used elsewhere. Platoons assigned to hunting one man were platoons not supporting attacks. Artillery rounds fired at empty ground were shells not fired at advancing Soviet units. The Red Army did not need to exploit this consciously. The effect emerged naturally. One man had changed the tempo of an entire sector. And yet, for Oklopkov, nothing changed. Simple. He rose before dawn. He wrapped himself in white cloth. He told his comrades he was going hunting. Then he vanished into terrain that felt hostile to everyone else but him. He endured cold that numbed fingers and stiffened joints. He endured isolation that broke less disciplined men. He endured the knowledge that if he was wounded again, evacuation might not come in time. He endured because endurance was all he had ever known. The rifle was a tool. The blanket was a tool. The real weapon was his refusal to hurry. He had been wounded 4 times before becoming a sniper. His body already carried damage that should have ended his war. Each return to the front was quieter than the last. There were no speeches, no expectation of survival, just a continuation of something that had started long before the war, waiting, observing, acting only when the moment was certain. And snipers, trained to dominate space, found themselves trapped by time. They waited for him to act. He waited longer. They searched for signs. He erased them. They assumed he would make a mistake. He assumed they would. They did. Before, the numbers had become undeniable. Hundreds of confirmed kills attributed to a single sniper across nearly 3 years of combat. The scale was unprecedented, but even the numbers failed to capture the true effect. The real achievement was not how many men Oklopkov killed. It was how many men he forced to stop fighting. Their behavior because of him. Entire sectors slowed because of him. Entire command structures reacted to the threat of a man they could not locate, intimidate, or eliminate. The blanket had become more than camouflage. Inevitability. A war defined by machinery, mass production, and overwhelming force, one Siberian hunter had proven that patience, applied without mercy, could still bend the battlefield to the will of a single man. By the final years of the war, Fyodor Oklopkov had become something far more dangerous than a weapon. He had become a constant. Constancy mattered more than spectacle. Battles came and went, units rotated, commanders were replaced. But in certain sectors of the Karelian front, the same quiet pressure never lifted. Men still died without warning. Observation posts still fell silent. Patrols still returned with fewer soldiers than they had departed with. Oklopkov did not surge in effectiveness. He did not escalate his methods. He simply endured. Endurance was what made him nearly impossible to counter. German command searched for climactic moments, a duel, a decisive engagement, a mistake that could be exploited. None came. There was no dramatic confrontation to report, no proof of death to circulate through the ranks. The hunter remained unresolved, and unresolved threats weigh on the human mind far more than visible ones. Countermeasures became increasingly desperate. Heavy artillery was used not to support advances, but to eliminate suspicion. Entire stretches of forest were shelled simply because silence felt dangerous. Ammunition was burned to buy psychological relief, not tactical advantage. It did not work. Oklopkov adapted without changing his habits. He learned artillery rhythms the same way he learned animal patterns. He knew how long barrages lasted. He knew how soldiers behaved afterward. He returned when the ground cooled and men relaxed, when helmets were removed and attention drifted. War was wearing down both sides, but it wore down his enemies faster. His body, however, was paying a price. Reached its peak, Oklopkov had already been wounded multiple times. Shrapnel, bullets, concussions. Each wound forced evacuation. Each recovery left him weaker. By conventional standards, he should never have returned to the front again. Anyway, when he did, no speeches, no sense of legend surrounding him. He did not cultivate an image. He did not seek recognition. To the men who served beside him, he was quiet, reserved, almost gentle. When asked how long he would be gone, he never answered precisely. He simply said he was going hunting. Words carried weight. Hours or days, someone else would be dying. The Red Army pushed westward and the balance of the war shifted decisively against Germany. Oklopkov continued operating the same way he always had. He did not chase retreating units. He did not exploit chaos for rapid kills. He maintained the same deliberate pace. The hunt did not end simply because the enemy was losing. Consistency mattered more than aggression. Retreating armies are at their most dangerous when they are panicked. Oklopkov denied them that release. Fear followed them even as they pulled back. The forest remained hostile. The snow remained lethal. May 1945, when Germany finally surrendered, Oklopkov was still alive. That fact alone was extraordinary. 4 years of combat. He had been wounded 4 times. He had operated alone in some of the most lethal conditions of the war. He had achieved 429 confirmed sniper kills, the highest verified total in Soviet history. And he had done it without spectacle, propaganda, or myth-making. When the war ended, the silence followed him home. In June 1945, he marched in the Victory Parade in Moscow. Like thousands of others, he passed through Red Square, one figure among many. There was no special attention, no public celebration of what he had done. Shortly after, he was demobilized. Turned to Yakutia. No monuments waiting. He went back to work. He served in local administrative roles. He raised a family. He lived the life of a man whose war had ended but whose body remembered every moment of it. In 1944, before the war had even finished, Oklopkov had been nominated for the title Hero of the Soviet Union, the highest honor the state could bestow. The nomination should have been automatic. Others with far fewer confirmed kills had received it. It was rejected. Never clearly stated. Officially, it was a bureaucratic decision. Unofficially, the truth was simpler and more uncomfortable. Oklopkov was Yakut. He came from an indigenous Siberian community far from Moscow. He had no political connections. He did not fit the image the Soviet state preferred for its heroes. Other snipers were elevated into symbols. Oklopkov faded into obscurity. For 20 years, he lived without the recognition he had earned. The most lethal confirmed sniper in Soviet history was known only to those who had fought beside him and those who had faced him. The state remained silent. His body continued to deteriorate. The wounds that had not killed him during the war slowly did their work in peacetime. Pain became constant. Strength faded. The cold he had once mastered settled permanently into his bones. In 1965, 2 decades after the war's end, did the silence finally break. Veterans petitioned the government. Records were re-examined. Testimonies were gathered. The truth could no longer be ignored. Fyodor Oklopkov was finally awarded the title Hero of the Soviet Union and the Order of Lenin. 57 years old. Restore his health, but not too late to restore his place in history. 3 years later, in 1968, he died at the age of 60. The cause was not a bullet or a shell, but the accumulated damage of a war his body had survived but never truly escaped. The blanket that had once made him invisible had done its work too well. For decades, his story remained buried under snow and silence, but the truth endured, not because it was celebrated, but because it was undeniable. Man, one rifle, one method. Learned, slowly and painfully, what it meant to be hunted. When the snow finally melted and the guns fell silent, the war moved on without Fyodor Oklopkov. History did what it often does best. It remembered the stories that were easy to tell. It remembered dramatic duels, clear villains, and cinematic confrontations. It remembered heroes who fit the image a nation wanted to project. It remembered names that could be turned into symbols. And in doing so, it allowed other stories to fade, not because they were less important, but because they were quieter. Oklopkov's story was one of those. It defined him. No famous showdown, no photograph of a triumphant victor standing over a defeated enemy. What defined him was repetition, patience applied day after day, month after month, until it reshaped an entire battlefield. War was not fought in speeches or charges. It was fought in stillness. In hours spent unmoving in snow so cold it burned the skin. In decisions not to fire when firing would have felt satisfying. In restraint so complete that the enemy never knew where the danger truly lay. This is why the white blanket mattered. It was a statement, a rejection of spectacle, a refusal to be seen. Wrapped in white, Oklopkov did not challenge the battlefield, he erased himself from it, and in that erasure, he became impossible to counter. Modern militaries still struggled to teach what he practiced instinctively. Technology evolves. Weapons become faster, louder, more precise. But patience cannot be mechanized. Environmental understanding cannot be issued as equipment. And the psychological effect of uncertainty remains as powerful now as it was on the Karelian front. Soldiers were not broken by numbers alone. They were broken by the sense that they were being watched by something they could not fight, that the ground beneath them was hostile. That safety was an illusion that could vanish at any moment. It's the true legacy of Oklopkov. Confirmed kills, impressive as that number is, not medals awarded too late, but the demonstration that warfare is not only a contest of force, but of perception, of who controls fear, time, and silence. Proved that the most lethal advantage is not aggression, but inevitability. In the end, Oklopkov did not seek recognition. He did not write memoirs. He did not shape his own myth. He returned home, raised children, worked ordinary jobs, and carried the war inside a body that never fully healed. The hunter became a civilian again, not because the war had changed him into something else, but because it had merely revealed who he already was. And shaped by environment rather than ideology, by necessity rather than ambition. For decades, few people spoke his name, yet the truth persisted quietly, passed between veterans, preserved in records, waiting for someone to look past the stories that shouted and find the one that whispered. The greatest warriors are not always the loudest. Sometimes they are the ones who disappear into the landscape, do their work without witnesses, and leave behind nothing but altered behavior, abandoned ground, and a silence that tells its own story. For Oklopkov did not win the war alone. In front, he proved something timeless. A man understands his environment better than his enemy understands him. When patience replaces impulse, and when fear is allowed to do the killing before the bullet ever arrives, one person can hold an army in place. What it takes is snow. Part of it. War stories are often told as contests of strength, technology, or numbers. Armies clash, weapons improve, production figures rise, and victory is explained through material superiority. Yet the story of Fyodor Oklopkov exposes a deeper and more uncomfortable truth about warfare. That the decisive factor is often not what an army possesses, but how a human being thinks, waits, adapts, and endures inside an environment that refuses to be controlled. The first lesson of Oklopkov's story is that preparation for war does not always come from military training. Modern armies invest enormous effort in doctrine, drills, and standardized instruction. These systems are necessary, but they can also blind commanders to forms of competence that exist outside institutional frameworks. Oklopkov was not shaped by manuals or classrooms. He was shaped by Siberia. His understanding of cold, silence, terrain, and patience was not theoretical. It was lived knowledge acquired in a place where mistakes were fatal long before the war arrived. When the Eastern Front became a war of endurance rather than maneuver, that lived knowledge suddenly mattered more than formal expertise. The lesson is not that training is useless, but that training divorced from environmental reality creates vulnerability. Armies that ignore the lived experience of their soldiers risk overlooking their most effective assets. Tied to this is the lesson that environment is not a backdrop to war, but an active participant. German doctrine assumed that terrain was something to be mastered through technology and coordination. Roads could be crossed, forests cleared, winters endured. That assumption worked in Western Europe. It failed catastrophically in the Soviet Union. Oklopkov did not fight against the environment. He aligned himself with it. Snow became concealment, cold became protection, silence became a weapon. The environment did not merely support his actions, it amplified them. This suggests a broader truth. Wars are rarely decided by who imposes control most forcefully, but by who adapts most completely. The side that treats terrain as an enemy to be conquered often loses to the side that treats it as an ally to be understood. Another lesson emerges from Oklopkov's refusal to seek dominance in the conventional sense. German snipers were trained to control ground, maintain firing positions, and impose pressure through repeated engagements. This approach assumes that persistence equals superiority. Oklopkov rejected that assumption entirely. He did not seek to own space. He sought to deny certainty. By firing once and disappearing, he transformed the battlefield from a contest of strength into a problem of anxiety. His power did not come from presence, but from unpredictability. This reveals a fundamental psychological truth about conflict. Humans are more affected by uncertainty than by threat itself. A known danger can be managed. An unknown one corrodes morale. Oklopkov weaponized that fact without ever articulating it. This follows a lesson about fear as a strategic force. Fear is often treated as a byproduct of combat, something to be managed or overcome. Oklopkov treated fear as the objective. His kills mattered not only for the lives they took, but for the behavior they altered. German soldiers stopped exposing themselves. Officers avoided leadership positions. Units slowed down. Resources were diverted. All of this occurred without a dramatic escalation of violence. Fear did the work that artillery and armor could not. This demonstrates that psychological dominance can achieve outcomes that physical force alone cannot. Wars are not fought solely in trenches and forests, but in the minds of those who must decide whether to move, wait, or retreat. The story also teaches that restraint can be more powerful than aggression. In most combat narratives, success is associated with initiative, speed, and decisive action. Oklopkov's success came from the opposite qualities. He waited, he observed, he allowed opportunities to ripen instead of forcing them. He accepted long periods of inactivity because he understood that impatience creates mistakes. This runs counter to many military cultures that prize action for its own sake. Yet the lesson is clear. Action without advantage wastes resources and reveals position. Restraint preserves options. In environments where survival depends on concealment and endurance, the ability to do nothing at the right time becomes a form of strength. A critical lesson concerns individuality within mass warfare. World War II is often remembered as a conflict decided by industrial capacity and mass mobilization. Millions fought, and millions died. Against that scale, the actions of one man seem insignificant. Oklopkov's story challenges that assumption. He did not change the outcome of the war alone, but he altered the reality of the battlefield in his sector. He forced an army to react to him. He consumed resources disproportionate to his physical presence. This suggests that even in industrialized warfare, individual agency still matters. Systems can be disrupted by humans who operate outside expected patterns. No amount of mass production can fully eliminate the impact of a single adaptive mind. Also a lesson about doctrine as both strength and weakness. German sniper doctrine was effective under certain conditions. It failed when those conditions changed. Doctrine provides structure, but it also creates predictability. Oklopkov exploited that predictability relentlessly. He understood not only how soldiers fought, but how they were taught to fight. When doctrine becomes rigid, it becomes exploitable. This lesson extends beyond military contexts. Any system that rewards conformity and discourages deviation risks being outmaneuvered by those who are willing to ignore its rules. Flexibility is not disorder, it is survival. Oklopkov's repeated wounding and return to the front highlight another uncomfortable truth. Endurance often comes at a cost that is invisible in official records. His body absorbed damage that no statistic can fully capture. Each wound did not end his war. It prolonged it in a diminished state. The lesson here is about the hidden price of resilience. Societies celebrate endurance without fully acknowledging what it extracts from individuals. Oklopkov survived the war, but the war never left him. His later life was shaped by pain accumulated in silence. This forces a reevaluation of how victory is measured. Survival is not the same as wholeness. The delayed recognition he received exposes lessons about memory, power, and narrative. Oklopkov did not fit the image the Soviet state wanted to project. He was indigenous, remote, and unassuming. His effectiveness did not translate easily into propaganda. As a result, his story was sidelined. This illustrates how institutions choose which sacrifices to honor and which to ignore. History is not a neutral record of events. It is a curated narrative shaped by politics, identity, and convenience. The lesson is that absence from official memory does not imply insignificance. Often, it implies discomfort. Closely related is the lesson about quiet competence versus visible heroism. Oklopkov did not perform heroism in ways that attracted attention. He did not seek recognition. He did not dramatize his actions. He simply did his work. In modern culture, effectiveness is often confused with visibility. Loud achievements are rewarded. Silent ones are overlooked. Oklopkov's life reminds us that the most consequential actions are sometimes those that leave no spectacle behind. Impact does not require an audience. Another lesson concerns the limits of technology. German snipers had superior optics, training, and support. None of it guaranteed success. Oklopkov's advantage lay not in equipment, but in integration with his environment. Technology can amplify human capability, but it cannot replace understanding. When technology becomes a substitute for adaptation, it creates fragility. The lesson is not to reject technology, but to recognize its dependence on human judgment. Tools are only as effective as the mind that wields them. Also a lesson about time as a weapon. Oklopkov did not rush to accumulate kills. His average was steady, sustainable, and psychologically devastating. Time worked in his favor because he understood its effects on morale and behavior. German units did not collapse overnight. They eroded gradually. This reflects a broader truth. Strategic outcomes often emerge from accumulation rather than breakthrough. Patience allows small advantages to compound until they become decisive. German units altered their behavior reveals another lesson. Perception shapes reality. Once soldiers believed a sector was dangerous, it became dangerous, regardless of Oklopkov's physical presence at any given moment. Fear created self-imposed limitations. Soldiers exposed themselves less, gathered less intelligence, and reacted more slowly. This shows how beliefs, once established, can outlast the conditions that created them. In warfare and beyond, managing perception can be as important as managing resources. Oklopkov's post-war life offers lessons about transition and silence. He did not return home as a celebrated hero. He became an administrator, a worker, a father. This transition underscores how societies struggle to integrate those shaped by extreme environments back into ordinary life. The skills that ensured survival in war often have no clear place in peace. Patience, vigilance, and emotional restraint can become burdens rather than assets. The lesson is that the end of conflict does not automatically resolve its consequences. Another lesson lies in the contrast between Oklopkov and more famous figures. Others with fewer confirmed kills became legends because their stories fit narrative needs. Oklopkov did not. This reveals that fame is not a reliable indicator of significance. It is a product of storytelling, not performance. For historians, strategists, and individuals alike, the lesson is to look beyond surface narratives and examine underlying effects. The blanket itself carries symbolic lessons. It represents adaptation through simplicity. Oklopkov did not rely on complex camouflage systems. He used what was available. The blanket was effective because it matched the environment, not because it was sophisticated. This reinforces a principle often forgotten in modern planning. Complexity is not inherently superior. Simplicity, when aligned with context, can outperform elaborate solutions. The story also teaches about humility before reality. Oklopkov did not believe he could dominate the battlefield. He believed he could survive within it. This humility allowed him to act effectively. German doctrine assumed control. Oklopkov assumed uncertainty. The one who assumed uncertainty adapted. The one who assumed control broke. This lesson extends beyond war. Systems that acknowledge uncertainty are more resilient than those that deny it. Another important lesson is about the relationship between identity and capability. Oklopkov's background as a Yakut was not incidental. His identity shaped his experience, his skills, and his worldview. Yet that identity also contributed to his marginalization. The lesson is that diversity of background can be a strategic asset when recognized and a strategic loss when ignored. Organizations that homogenize their personnel risk losing the very differences that allow adaptation. Oklopkov's story teaches a lesson about inevitability. His method created a sense that death would come eventually.